If you pay attention to Donald Trump's foreign policy rhetoric in recent days, you'll notice that it has changed a bit. And now Donald Trump has already started to become, if I may say so, more pro-Ukrainian, expressing less admiration for the dictator Putin and, excuse my language, criticizing the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, less. Well, and in addition, some reshuffling and changes have suddenly started happening within Donald Trump's team. In particular, Marco Rubio, who is the Secretary of State of the United States of America, will now also be responsible for the national security of the United States. And this is the first time in 50 years that one person will be in charge of both diplomacy and the security of the United States. Republicans, on the one hand, are concerned about the excessive centralization of power. On the other hand, Marco Rubio is already being called the new Kissinger, to whom Trump is handing over absolutely all the reins of foreign policy. And from this perspective, he states that he is already not entirely satisfied with the work of Steve Vitkov, who flew to meet with the dictator Putin. And in this regard, after the State Department's statement that they are supposedly completely withdrawing from negotiations on Russia's war against Ukraine, today there is a message from Zelensky that Ukraine is preparing a new meeting of national security advisors. And Marco Rubio himself will be present there. There will be a meeting between Ukraine, France, the United Kingdom, Germany and the United States of America, and Marco Rubio will be present there. Therefore, in this episode, we will discuss with you the increase in the role of Marco Rubio in Donald Trump's team, and in which direction diplomacy and in general the foreign policy of the United States of America might now go, provided that Marco Rubio is responsible for both diplomacy and national security. My name is Alexei Pichi. Today is May 3rd. Let's discuss things sequentially. So, as you know, the day before, Donald Trump officially fired Mike Waltz, who was the national security advisor to the President of the United States in America, and he was sent to the United Nations organization. But no one has been officially appointed to his position yet, although Marco Rubio has been temporarily assigned as the acting national security advisor. But Marco Rubio remains the Secretary of State of the United States of America, who is fully responsible for the diplomacy and foreign policy of this country. And now a situation has arisen in which, for the first time in 50 years, one person will be in charge of both diplomacy and the security of the United States. And three high-ranking representatives of the White House noted that Marco Rubio will, for at least 6 months, simultaneously perform the duties of both the United States Secretary of State and the President's National Security Advisor. According to sources, a number of President Donald Trump's advisors are interested in having Marco Rubio hold both positions on a permanent basis. Moreover, one of the White House officials noted that Marco Rubio's recent appointment was not actually considered a temporary measure. They say that while it was announced as temporary, in reality Trump intends to keep him permanently in the role responsible for both diplomacy and security. Despite the fact that Marco Rubio was not actually seeking this position, President Trump and White House Chief of Staff Susie Wales urged him to take on broader powers in foreign policy and to strengthen control over the administration's foreign policy direction. Here's an interesting point. The thing is, just a couple of weeks ago we had information leaks and insider reports that there was a scandal within Donald Trump's team. It was specifically between Marco Rubio and Steve Vitkov, Donald Trump's special representative, who flew to meet with Putin. And this conflict was born not even between these two officials, but rather between their teams. Because many Republicans began calling on Donald Trump to give credit to Marco Rubio and said that Steve Vitkov is actually not responsible for diplomacy at all. Who is Steve Vitkov anyway? Many Republicans started asking, why isn't the person who is supposed to be handling diplomacy and negotiations actually doing it? United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio and some Republicans called on Donald Trump to remove this Steve Vitkov and let the country's chief diplomat handle diplomacy. They said Marco Rubio is a very competent diplomat, so he should be the one handling this. As a result, people in Trump's team are now dissatisfied with Vitkov. There have already been certain leaks about this. And Marco Rubio now holds the positions of chief diplomat and chief national security advisor. And so, according to information from the publication, this appointment became a significant promotion for Trump's former rival in the 2016 primary. Back then, let me remind you, Rubio and Trump exchanged sharp personal attacks, And now some representatives of the Make America Great Again movement view him with suspicion. That is, not everyone likes Rubio. And as one high-ranking official emphasized, quote, "He is simply the quintessential team player who is ready to take on any task necessary for the president, including difficult or risky ones." According to another official, Marco Rubio's task is to ensure the stability and prioritization of the National Security Council's work in such a way that its activities align as closely as possible with the president's vision. The official emphasized that Marco Rubio is the ideal candidate for this role because he understands the process and foreign policy and also works well with the team. And that is very important. Among Rubio's key advantages, according to officials, is also his loyalty. Since the beginning of his tenure as Secretary of State, he has moved away from a number of previous positions, particularly on support for Ukraine, and has also been an active advocate for President Trump's immigration policy. Despite his own Cuban heritage, these changes have drawn criticism from some traditional Republicans and other foreign policy experts who consider him an ally. As one official stated, "You need a team player who will be very honest with the president and senior leadership, and not someone who tries to build an empire or wields a knife or pushes their own agenda. He is focused solely on carrying out the president's agenda." On the other hand, we must not forget that advisors also have influence on Donald Trump. Thus, promoting Marco Rubio also has its own impact. Now, some experts are already suggesting that if, during the first 100 days of his presidency, Donald Trump conditionally listened to such players as J.D. Vance or Elon Musk, who, regarding Ukraine, were shouting that it was necessary to simply force Ukraine to capitulate, fulfill Putin's demands, and just build some business relations with Moscow, make deals, count money, and simply forget about Ukraine. So now, in the second 100-day period, it looks like Trump is now listening more to Marco Rubio. And Marco Rubio, despite all his statements, takes a more reasonable position on the war between Russia and Ukraine. And many assume that it is precisely because of Rubio's closeness to Trump that Rubio was able to somewhat influence Trump to have slightly different views. Of course, it's not just him, but he also had his influence, yes, and to such an extent that Trump decided that this person should be responsible for both diplomacy and security. Well, that's it. Sources from the publication Politico note that at first there was some concern about the scale and scope of the work in the positions of Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. But then they recall that Henry Kissinger was the only one who held both of these positions in the administrations of Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. He used the dual position to exert his own influence on the process and became one of the most influential presidential aides in history. In recent days, officials in the Trump administration have concluded that combining both roles is not only possible, but can also create a synergistic effect. As one of the officials said, quote, "One of them is an organizer, a gatherer of facts and an articulator of policy, while the other is a diplomatic leader. I realized that they can be more complementary than I thought." Regarding other potential candidates for the position of National Security Advisor, this unnamed official stated that these searches should be stopped. "We already have a strong candidate who is ready to work. That is, most likely Marco Rubio will remain just like Henry Kissinger once did, both as United States Secretary of State and as the President's National Security Advisor in America." But even here, suddenly, why do I say that it seems Trump has started to listen a bit to the other camp? This is a signal that, remember how Vance, by the way, Rubio also said this, and how this camp, which is more inclined toward Juris Doctor Vance, and to Elon Musk and Steve Vitkov, they claimed that we're supposedly all abandoning the negotiations and tired of this, essentially blaming Zelensky. How, basically, can you go to war when you're not ready for it, and so on and so on? Well, that's everything we've heard, all this criticism that was directed at Ukraine and the lack of criticism that was never directed at Moscow. Recently, Trump's stance has shifted and he has begun criticizing Moscow more openly. They are already promising to strengthen sanctions, and military aid packages from Donald Trump's administration for Ukraine are already appearing. And it's obvious that the rhetoric is starting to shift. And the strengthening of Marco Rubio's role may signal that this camp, which is conditionally pro-Ukrainian, has managed to take a leading position in Donald Trump's mind. And what is changing? What exactly is changing? According to Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, Ukraine wants to hold another meeting of national security advisors with the participation of the United States, Britain, France, and Germany. The meeting at the level of national security advisors will be a continuation of the recent negotiations in London and Paris last month. So how should we proceed, Zelensky? I can't set a date yet due to recent changes in the United States. Well, that's a hint that Mike Volks was removed and Mark Rubio was appointed. So Mark Rubio, it seems we need a little time apparently to acclimate, if you will. Zelensky hinted at that. Because the United States Secretary of State, Mark Rubio, may be present at the meeting since all of Volks's duties have been assigned to him. Next is a quote from Zelensky. I think that now the powers of the National Security Advisor will probably be with the Foreign Minister, Mark Rubio. The advisors' meeting will follow this format. That means no one will be expecting a new leader. That's how it seems to me. On the contact, advisors from all countries except Russia, America, Europe, and Ukraine are currently involved in events spanning yesterday, today, and the day before. Also, Zelensky believes that Ukraine, together with Europe, conveyed the correct position to the United States, but the Russians rejected it. Another quote, Steve Vitkov showed the proposal, and of course the proposals were not accepted by the Russians. I think he was very surprised, because from the hugs, the first meetings and lunches, the first introductions, I think he's entering a phase where things will only get worse and worse. Well, I mean, these enthusiasms of Steve Vitkov when he hugged Putin, shook his hand, had lunch with him, and then he would come to Washington and tell Trump how much Putin longs for peace. He just says, please give me peace, make these Ukrainians agree to peace as soon as possible, and supposedly the Ukrainians didn't want that. Steve Vitkov now sees that he was being deceived all this time in the Kremlin, and so was Trump. That's why Trump is starting to get disappointed. Leaks about this are already appearing around Steve Vitkov, and it's possible that in the near future Steve Vitkov will be pushed a bit into the background. But Marco Rubio, who is more pragmatic, let's say a diplomat and politician, is reaching a whole new level. So friends, I'll leave it at that for now. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. Friends, I ask you to support the work of this channel financially. You can do this by making any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. There you will find PayPal, bank details, the Patreon platform, the Buy Me a Coffee platform, and sponsorship on YouTube. Choose any convenient option for you. I appreciate your support. That's all. Take care. Bye, everyone.